Thank you very much. I'm Mark Bowden. I was in high school for most of the war in Vietnam, but these gentlemen to my right were active journalists in Vietnam. John Olson, who did a lot of reporting for a number of outlets, including Life magazine and Stars and Stripes, and Cal Posner, who was with the 101st Airborne working as a journalist in Vietnam. So I thought I would begin by asking John if you would introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about your background and your work during the war.
Well, Mark, thank you. You know, it's terrific to be here today. It's terrific to be here on behalf of Stars and Stripes and to share a little bit about my time there with you. You know, I'd always wanted to be a photographer, and when I grew up in the 60s, the premier place to work was Life magazine. Life would arrive every Wednesday, and we'd see the essays that were being published. And at that time when I was in high school, I remember all the Vietnam stories come across. And I really set as a goal to be a world-class photojournalist and a world-class war photographer. And I guess that really goes to say, be careful what you wish for. I very much wanted to be there for a wire service or a magazine, but the Army got me first, and I was very fortunate after having been in Vietnam for a while to have become the sole combat photographer in Vietnam for Stars and Stripes. I then, because of some photographs I made during the Tet Offensive of 1968, that were published in Life magazine, I became the youngest photographer ever hired to the staff of the magazine. So that's a little bit of my background.
Cal?
Hi. I went into the Army in 1966, right out of high school. And on my second day in the Army at Fort Jackson, South Carolina Basic Training Center, a Spec 4 asked me what I liked to do in college. And I told him that I was one of two photographers for the sports teams for the yearbook and the newspaper. And he said, we got that in the U.S. Army. It's called combat photographer. So that's how I got enlisted to be a combat photographer. And I went through DINFOS, and my very first overseas assignment was with Stars and Stripes in Korea. And then I went to Vietnam from there. And Joe was there a little bit before me. I got there in December of 1968 and stayed through January 70, and I was with the 101st Airborne Division, and mostly with their 3rd Brigade, which was north and, I guess, east part of the country. It's where the Ashall Valley was, and where what came to be known as Hamburger Hill used to be. It's now almost flat, but so I was there for a year and came back and stayed in the Army another 23 years and retired from there.
All right, Cal, I'll ask you first. Tell us what it was like to do the work you were doing in Vietnam. Were you based somewhere? How did you get where you were going? How did you decide what you were going to cover, what you were going to do? How did it happen?
Well, our operation went like this. There were actually 5 of us working out of Camp Eagle, Vietnam, which was the headquarters of the 101st. And we would go out to various fire bases and hook up with companies that were going on patrol. Or if a fire mission was called into the artillery at the fire base, we would cover that. When we got 3 or 4 or 5 rolls of film and some stories, we would give them to the logistics pilot, and they would fly them back to Camp Eagle to be processed and whatever. And so we stayed in the field for literally weeks at a time.
And that, you know, that would be a surprise to young listeners who are used to the internet and cell phones and instant international communications, that it was really quite a challenge sometimes to get your material out.
Yeah, it was manual, and you had to do something for the pilots in order for them to get it. So we would always make extra pictures and make sure we got their tail numbers and the photos, and hand them out to them every once in a while. They would send them home. That was how we bribed them. Nobody had any money over there. So.
Well, in Iran, there's no such thing as a bribe, but they have what they call a success fee. So you paid a success fee. John, tell us about how you went about your reporting in Vietnam.
Well, I'd just like to interject something on what you just said. We're making a comparison to how we moved our film and our stories in 1968, and when we reflect back on that and compare that to how it's done today, it's certainly like something from the Middle Ages. But at that time, what we were doing was state of the art. We were moving information from one part of the country on a helicopter to another part of the country, and then that was being moved out of Saigon either by air if it were film, and it would fly back either to Tokyo or to the States. So when I see what's being done today, it's absolutely incredible. But at the time we did it, it also seemed like magic. But at the time, when I was at Stars and Stripes in late 1967 and 1968, Stars and Stripes had a bureau in Saigon. It was a villa. It was near Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and it was where the reporters lived and where they worked. And it's where I lived and where I would travel from. And now, when I was 12 years old, I knew I wanted to be this world-class photographer. And by the time I got to Stars and Stripes and learned how they operated, which was to say, they gave me the freedom to go wherever I wanted to go in Vietnam, do whatever I wanted to do. There were no constraints. It was totally left up to me what to cover, and which was an incredible freedom. And I would often go into the field for a number of days, and if you're a combat photographer, you can't fake it. You need to be in the middle of the heaviest fighting you can find. So the trick was finding it and getting to it. But once I would spend some days with a unit, I'd more than likely get on a plane and fly back to Saigon. And the film from there would be sent to Stripes in Tokyo for processing.
And John, how did you choose where you wanted to go? Did you have some inkling that there might be action? Is that what got you moving? And how, if so, how did you get that notion?
So that's again really another good question. As I remember back on the journalist community at that time, it was a small community. When I think of the number of photographers who went out on a daily basis, who were serious about capturing what the fighting was about, there weren't many of us. I would say maybe there were 20 between AP, UPI, Stars and Stripes, and the networks. A small handful. Everyone knew each other, and there was camaraderie there. And between this confluence of sources and news, you got a good inkling of what was happening, what operations were happening. Because one thing we really need to remember, at that time, the military was very much your friend. And they very much wanted to showcase their units. Would you agree? Do you agree, Cal? They wanted to showcase their units. So when an operation was about to take place, you knew about it. And when it came to the Tet Offensive, while none of us knew about it in advance, it was everywhere when it broke out on January 31st, 1968.
So Cal, when word came back that there was going to be action somewhere, was there like a stampede to get to that place? What was that like?
Well, it's hard when you only have 5 people to stampede, but no, all of us were assigned out to the various brigades. The 101st had 3 brigades, 1 down south and 2 up north, and we had to go everywhere, wherever the action was. So whenever there was a major confrontation, for example, in the Ashall or what came to be known as Hamburger Hill, perhaps is a better example, people came, all of our guys went out and covered it. And that was a really interesting story because nobody could understand, I mean, our tactical people couldn't understand why they were defending it so much. And normally, you know, if you took a couple of shots at them, they ran away, and they were standing and fighting and digging in, and nobody could figure out why. Later, after we overran the place, we found all the tunnels and came to find out it was a division headquarters, it was a hospital, it was an R&R site, it was everything. So, but yeah, we were out. If we caught some action, that was really great. If not, when the Tactical Operations Center called our boss, he was a division information officer, he would assign us out. That there was a battle going on and we needed to get there. And so we went down to the log pad and waited for the next helicopter out.
So I know, Cal, because you were with the 101st, you were in the Army, you know, your situation was different than John's, but I wanted to ask both of you, and I'll start with John, were there any restrictions on where you could go, what you photographed, and what correspondents, what writers could tell in their stories that you're aware of?
So I don't remember any circumstance where we were not allowed to go. There was one circumstance where there was a quota, and it was of people who could go into Quezon, and it was really about the ability. So many aircraft were being. It was tough to get in and tough to get out, and a lot of aircraft were being shot down. So they put a quota on us, and there's an interesting story about that. Now, I was drafted into the U.S. Army, and once I got to Stripes, I was an E4. I was an E4, and some people say I was working hard to become an E3 or less, but I was an E4. But we didn't have to wear rank, and I wore no rank. And one of the reasons I wore no rank is once you got into the field, people just assumed you were a civilian, and that gave, at least in my mind, it gave me a little bit more ability to do what I wanted to do and not have anyone doubt or what I should be doing. But so I was. On a regular basis, I tried to pass myself off not as an E4, but as a civilian. Now, going into Quezon was a different situation because they were limiting people going in. So I said, okay, I can work with that. I said, wait. I'm not a civilian. You can't apply that quota to me. I'm in the military. I'm an E4. So all of a sudden, and I had to make this case at the Da Nang Press Center, and I had to make it at another forward location. And finally, I got to this forward base that was loading the Chinooks going into Quezon, and I'm used to making this argument. And I went up to this big loadmaster loading these Chinooks, and I start to make the case. Listen, I know that there's a quota, but you should really allow me to get on this flight. He said, listen, boy, you want to go to Quezon? Just stand over there. And so back to what we were talking about, I never saw anyone affect where I could go, what I could photograph. in that regard, it was a fabulous organization to work for.
And how about you, Cal? Working for the Army and the 101st, did you have any restrictions on what you could report and write or photograph?
We had a few that we learned in photo school. One was you could not take a picture of a wounded soldier that was identifiable. And you couldn't take a landscape photo where there were 2 points on the map that were easily identifiable. Other than that, we were pretty much free to do whatever came up, and we were all, as the saying goes, victims of circumstance, you know. And I've been out on patrols and literally nothing happened. And you go on some patrols and they're shot up all the time. So, unlike John, I was limited to the units of the 101st. I just couldn't go anyplace. And but other than that, that was really it. I've never had a story edited for anything except spelling and grammar. I've had some pictures I wish the photo editors would have cropped differently, but other than that, no. We interviewed people, we interviewed soldiers, we interviewed civilians, we interviewed indigenous people, and it all went through. So.
Mark, if you don't mind, I'd really like to ask Cal a question here,
Sure.
because it's something that's very much always been on my mind here. When you got into the field, when you got out with the grunts, how were you accepted?
We were very well liked by the soldiers because we took a lot of pictures of everybody. And we had what we used to call overprints. So we would make prints of everything and make sure that they got them. And so next time we went to a fire base where we knew a unit was, I'd bring a stack of pictures of them holding M16s and all that sort of thing. So we were very well received, and we were given a lot of tips because we didn't have any infantry training. We were photographers, essentially. And one of the tips was never stand near the radio operator. And I've never forgotten that. So every time I see somebody with a radio on their back, which isn't often these days, but I move away from them. So.
And John, you mentioned that you're working shoulder to shoulder with all the civilian reporters and agencies that are there. Did you see a difference in the way that they went about their work and the way that you did?
There were the reporters and the photographers who worked for the wires, and then there were those reporters and cameramen who worked for the networks. And then there were other people there on different sort of with different sorts of responsibilities. People were there for the magazines, on specific essays and all, and long-term projects. When I think back as to the ways in which they may have worked differently, I think different publications had different demands. And if there was a large operation that was about to take place, you would see the networks spend a day with a unit and then leave because of the need to move. Nobody wanted to be beaten in their story. Everybody wanted to be competitive. When it came to photography and the wire services, if you went into the field with a unit for a day, a week, or longer, you needed something to occur before you could leave. Now, you might leave because nothing eventually happened, but a photographer without photographs has nothing to report. Basically, there were people there who were highly dedicated to doing what they had to do to come back with with their stories and their images, and other people who were there with slightly different agendas. And there were some people that when I look back, that were, I mean, there are when I think of photography, there are a handful of people there that are at this level, and primarily because it was a God-given skill they were given.
Well, we know that, you know, Vietnam was the last American conflict where the military really just opened the doors for journalists to go, as you say, where they pleased, to look for action, to seek out the stories that they wanted to find. And there's a reason for that, because a lot of the reporting that was being sent back by journalists, by network cameramen, were stories that the military was not eager to have told, or that contradicted the official accounts of things that were going on. They don't want me to talk right now. And, you know, just as an example, when I researched and wrote about the Battle of Hue, and John was there, you know, it was evident to everyone who was there that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had overrun the city, with the exception of a American base, small one on the southern part of the city, and a South Vietnamese Army base in the northern part of the city. The city was owned by the enemy. And yet, at that time, in Saigon, General Westmoreland's press conferences were announcing that nothing significant had happened, that there were only a handful of enemy soldiers in the city. So clearly that was an example where the photographs that you were taking and the stories that reporters were writing were directly contradicting official accounts. That was a new experience. Were you aware of that at the time?
Didn't have a clue of what. Well, let me put this into a broader perspective. When I went into the Battle of Khe Sanh, I thought it was another day of work. It was a unique battle. The photographs were different, but I put it into the perspective of being another day of work. When I went into the Battle of Hue, I approached it the same. It was violent. It was deadly. When I got there, the Marines had been there. The Marines of 1-5 had been there a few days before I had. They'd gone in with really bad intelligence information. They were dirty. They were hungry. They were tired. But we had no idea of how historic that battle would become, or how historic the Battle of Khe Sanh would become. It really required decades for me to understand that I'd been fortunate enough to witness that.
And Cal, were you ever aware that any of the other journalists that you were working alongside, civilian journalists, had a different agenda than you had?
At the time that I was there, I was an E4. I was promoted to E5 in August of 1969. Became a photo team chief then. The journalists that I worked with as an E4 were mostly representatives of advertising newspapers, you know, groups of small-town newspapers. And they just wanted to talk to soldiers from their hometowns. And so we would find them through personnel, and then we would hijack a helicopter and we would go around and, you know, meet them, and he would talk to them and take their picture and get back in the helicopter, and we would go somewhere else. The big guys, the network guys and stuff, our officer group, there were 3 officers with us, they would take those guys out. And so I never really got to work with the big guys while I was there. I did a little work with a film crew from one of the networks that was very disturbing, even at the time. And there was a lot of stuff going on, and I was excited that they, you know, I thought they wanted to go out, and what they wanted the appearance that they had gone out without actually going out. So there was a couple of bushes behind the division courthouse, and one guy went down there with a microphone, and this was in the days before video, so they had these big film cameras, and we had a couple of walking wounded guys on the other side shooting off M16s and AK-47s, and this guy's, oh, we're here with the 101st, and all this stuff, and it was really sad for me. So I've never really, ever since then, it's been over 50 years, ever trusted network news. Because I'm really not sure everything that they're doing is exactly, you're seeing what you think you see. So I think that was the only time I had any of the big guys working for me.
Okay. And by the way, we have a microphone up here. If anybody wants to step up and ask a question, I'll keep an eye on that microphone, and you're welcome to do so. Meanwhile, I will. You go ahead. Come on up. Yeah.
Question about Hamburger Hill. Yes. Because you were with 101st, and you brought up. I've always wondered, because there's very few photos of the battle, and my guess is, like maybe Colonel Honeycutt, who was commanding the Roxons, or someone just said, no, nobody in who isn't a trigger puller. But I'm just wondering, do you recall like why they didn't put some of you folks in during the battle?
Well, don't forget your microphone.
Well, I was there, and there were two other journalists there from the 101st, and we did take a lot of pictures. I have a thumb drive with a lot of them on it if you really want to see it.
All right, yeah. Super excited, because
okay.
I'm writing the book about that. So,
oh, okay.
Yeah, so.
Well, if you see me afterwards, I'd be happy to help you.
Glad to be of help. All right, so, I mean, that was an instance you described, Cal, where the network guys were not actually particularly eager to put themselves at risk. One crew, right.
I'm not speaking about all of them.
Sure.
The one that I was asked to escort, that's what they wanted to do.
Right. And so I want to ask a more general question, since you work with a lot of other, as you said, John, other cameramen, reporters who were there. Were there some who were shy about getting out into combat and some who were actually very eager to do so? Did you see that kind of a breakdown?
When I break down, when I arrived in Vietnam, as I mentioned earlier, I attribute a rough number of 20 photographers who were serious about their craft, who really wanted to be out there. And then there were a lot of hangers-on. There were a lot of some trust fund babies who were there for the experience, some of which went into danger, but who weren't necessarily serious about their craft. There were those who were thrill seekers, who went out to make photographs and often got hurt. There were those who were very serious about their craft, who on occasion got hurt as well. But there were also those who sorted themselves out very early on that it wasn't the career path that they decided to follow because of the danger involved.
And did you see the same, Cal? Were some photographers and reporters less eager than others to actually get out there where it's dangerous?
Actually, with that one exception that I mentioned earlier, most of the people I work with couldn't wait to get out there. There was one AP guy that I had the privilege of escorting around, and Jay Sharbert from, I think he was with the New York Times, and he later became their entertainment guy after the war. But anyway, he came, and he was a real pro, and he wanted to know if I had any more waterproof notebooks, because he couldn't get them himself, and so yeah, I gave him a couple of notebooks. And anyway, but he wanted to go. He asked me to get him into the TOC, so he could, which is the Tactical Operations Center, and I could barely get in there myself. They would always throw me out, and so I wasn't able to do that for him. But he wanted to go, and there were some others that wanted to go, and the guys from the local papers, they couldn't interview the people they wanted to interview if they weren't out in the field where the soldiers were. So they were very eager to go. I have one really bad experience at the press camp in Fubai. One of the reporters there, I don't know who, asked me if I knew any of the local girls, and I said, I'm sorry, sir. I'm a soldier in the United States Army. I'm not a pimp, and I don't know any local girls. Okay. So, but other than that, you know, everybody was there to do a job, and you know, it was going to make their career if you could get to a big battle and cover. You know, so they were fairly interested in going out.
Well, I'm a writer, and I learned a long time ago that there's a big difference when you get into a danger zone between writers and photographers. When I was in the Middle East one time during the first Intifada, I would always team up with photographers to go out to the field with them because they were the ones who knew where there were going to be clashes going on. So I remember we drove out one day, I drove out with a wonderful combat photographer named George Azar, and we drove out to Ramallah, where George knew every day there was a heated confrontation between the young Palestinian protesters and the Israeli Defense Forces. And so I drove out there with George, and he parked, and we walked out to the street, and he's pointing down the street to the mosque where we can hear the young protesters chanting. He says, they're going to come out of that building in a few minutes. And then he points in the other direction behind us, and there's the Israeli Defense Forces. They're getting ready to confront with them. And it occurs to me, I'm right in the middle of these two forces, right? And so suddenly the protesters come running out, the tear gas and the rubber bullets start flying, and George, I'm running. I'm going for the furthest place I can get to watch. And George, meanwhile, is pulling a gas mask off of his belt and wading with his camera into the middle of the fight. So, with that said, talk to me about the level of danger that you experience as photographers in a combat zone. And I will add, soldiers, as you said, very often will go out on patrol for days, even weeks at a time, and nothing happens. If your job is to find out where things are happening, you probably are exposing yourselves to more enemy fire than your average soldier in Vietnam. So, Cal, you want to talk first about your experiences?
Okay. This is tough. 84 Bravo, which is the MOS of a combat photographer in the Army, don't get any infantry training. The only weapons training we ever had was in basic training. So we didn't know how to pick up a machine gun and fire it or anything else. So it was much more dangerous for us to be with an infantry group in the jungle in Vietnam than it was for the average soldier. And somehow or other, they instinctively understood that, and they would stay around me after. I was there. I was the guy who was going to make them famous with a combat picture or something. And
their picture was going to be in their hometown newspaper
oh yeah,
because
absolutely,
of you.
Absolutely. So, when you're in combat, everybody's always in danger. People are trying to kill you. I mean, that's just the nature of war. But for us, it was particularly dangerous, and we lost a lot of good people on account of that. But I like your story about the difference between writers and photographers, because I've seen that happen. You know, one of the things they teach you in Army photo school is when the bullets are flying, don't stand up. Wait for them to stop. They're reloading. Then take your picture. And so I've always kept that little, grain of common sense in my head. So. Yeah, it was really interesting, and I will tell you, as a matter of personal experience, actually being in a war is much different than it's ever portrayed. I think, except in Saving Private Ryan, and maybe the one exception of how war actually goes on every day. It is not a lot of fun, and it's if you remember that everybody who doesn't look like you is trying to kill you, and will take every opportunity you give them to do so. That is not a really good way to live. And back in the days of Vietnam, the Army only sent people over there one time for a year. Now they send people over 5 and 6 times and wonder why they have a mental health issue. You know, well, I can tell you, you're sending people into combat too much. That's why. You can't do that. People come back from a year and they are not the same as when they went over. And so it's a very unique, different, emotional experience. And the guys that I were with, we were an airborne division. Everybody was a paratrooper. We were used to danger. We jump out of airplanes for a living, and this was completely foreign of that.
John, can you talk about I know you were in the thick of Hue, certainly, Khe Sanh, others. What was that like for you?
You know, I look forward to answering this question, and then if I may, I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
So, I heard an adage decades ago, and I don't remember who shared it with me, but I think it's very applicable to the jobs of our war correspondents. And that is, don't worry about the bullet with your name on it. Worry about all those flying around that say, to whom it may concern. And I was very fortunate. I didn't realize until not that long ago, actually, if I were to write a book, the title would be Wired Wrong, because I never felt any fear. And it's not because I've got any bravery. It's just that I was wired wrong. Now, having said that, I also had an angel. And I can think of at least 3 scenarios under which I was about to do something, and I said, maybe let me hold back a little bit. It's a very dangerous profession, but my mindset was they can't kill all of us. And the difference between being hurt or not hurt, you really don't have any control over it if you want to be in that profession. It's a matter of luck. And I was very lucky. Now, a mistake many people I knew made was they stayed too long. After I was discharged from the Army, I went back working for Life magazine, and I was in the DMZ one day. And there were 2 tanks. I was with the Marines, and some mortars came in, no big deal. And that confluence of events caused me to say, if I continue to do this, I'm going to die. I flew back to Saigon. I went to my bureau manager and I said, Don, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to die. The magazine was terrific. They said, don't go anywhere, let us figure out what we're going to do with you. 2 weeks later, they reassigned me to Washington. I came to work during the Nixon administration. The mistake so many talented people made is they stayed too long, because sooner or later, it's going to get you. There were days and days, and if you were to go with a unit, there would be often days and days and days of boredom, followed by 30 minutes of terror, where you made your photographs. And the advantage a combat photographer has in a situation like that, when things are really bad, you're busy. you're doing what you're trained to do. And now, to extend on that a bit, if I may, during the Battle of Hue, I was there a short time. A huge advantage I had was if you're a grunt, you're out there in the field, your destiny is controlled by someone else. You're there for however long you're ordered to be there. I never had that constraint. And in the back of your mind, it's a great safety valve, knowing I can leave when I want to leave. Now, I was there because I wanted to be there. I was there because I wanted to make photographs that showed what it was like to be in the middle of combat. But nevertheless, what I did compared to anyone who served in the field in a combat role, my job was a walk in the park. But I want to ask Mark a question. Now, so I was in the Battle of Hue, February 1968. Decades later, Mark wrote a book on the Battle of Hue. And you and people working with you reached out to the ex-NVA and the ex-Viet Cong. What was it like for them? What was it like covering that story? What did you learn that we may not have read, or?
Well, if you've read Hue, you've read it, because I wrote what they had to tell me. But it was, I had the very good fortune to work with a retired Vietnamese military officer named Dang Hoa Ho. And Hoa is much too young to have fought in what they call the American War, but he had a long experience in the Vietnamese military. So he had connections that enabled me to find retired Viet Cong soldiers, North Vietnamese Army soldiers who had fought in Hue. And to be honest, John, their stories were not any different than the stories that the American soldiers told, except in one big particular. They were fighting for their country. They were filled with a sense of mission, and they were so proud, even when I was interviewing them almost 50 years later, of themselves, of their comrades who fought and who were killed. Obviously, they feel they were victorious. They were victorious. And so they were filled with a sense of pride, of accomplishment, but also of what they had given for their country's independence. I found American soldiers were very proud of their service. They were proud of their fellow soldiers. They had deep friendships that lasted throughout their lives, but much more bewildered about why they had fought, with mixed feelings. I mean, I still had soldiers 50 years later who were convinced that the United States was about to win that war, and that we would have won the war if Johnson hadn't done this, or if the New York Times hadn't done this, or if Walter Cronkite hadn't done that. They were convinced that they were on the road to victory. Others were believed and were very bitter, felt that their patriotism, their idealism, which led in many cases for them to volunteer to fight in Vietnam, was betrayed by either by an administration that didn't believe that they could win the war, that didn't fully commit to it, or by civilians, journalists here in the United States who reported things that turned people around, turned people against the war. So that was the big difference between those two groups. So let me ask you, since you were journalists in the war, do you feel that journalism lost the war for the United States, Cal?
No, I don't. Because our job, and I think that most journalists and photographers did it very well, was to portray the truth of what was happening. And I know I did, I know John did, and we took pictures of what was going on, and we wrote about people who came and visited. We had a lot of VIPs come through. And my sense is that all wars are political, and the politics just failed us in the end. I can tell you as a fact that the United States Army never lost a battle in Vietnam, not one. Never lost a battle. Fought hard several times, for like maybe a week at a time. Lost a lot of people, but they didn't lose the battle, and so they made their mission. And the only thing that comes to my mind is that in the end, the politics just failed us.
John?
I have a little interesting spin on your question, if I may. Earlier I mentioned how there were people out there who felt Stars and Stripes was an arm of U.S. government policy. Those of us who worked there really worked hard to prove that wrong. I mean, the reporters and myself, we'd never seen any of it, and we didn't want to be associated with that concept. I went into the Battle of Hue as an E4 working for Stars and Stripes. Much of my photography ended up being published in Life magazine, 6 pages. There were dead and dying Marines shown in some of my photography. Years later, I've been told that that series really fueled the anti-war movement. I don't know if that's true or not. It's really for others to decide. But my point is, Stars and Stripes allowed us to distribute those images to the media that published them without any restrictions whatsoever.
So it illustrates one of the great strengths of a democracy of the United States, but also a very real weakness of a democracy. I mean, you can see in Ukraine right now, Russia is up against it, and they're recruiting hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sending them to fight in Ukraine. And Russian people are being told that they're very victorious, that they're winning the war, that all things are hunky-dory because the Russian government controls all the media outlets. So it's much easier to sustain a war, even a losing war, if you're a totalitarian. But when you live in a democracy and you send reporters out to actually look at what's going on and write about what's happening, sometimes the public doesn't like what it's seeing. Sometimes it doesn't believe in the mission. And if you want to sustain war in a democracy, you have to be able to convince people that what you're telling them is true, number one, and that it's worth doing and that it's being accomplished. That's my take on it. Cal?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I was in the Army for 24 years, and I learned a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I learned in the Army was that when you go to war, the very first thing you do, it doesn't look like war. It looks like chess. You position the resources on the map instead of the game board. And what's scary about that is we have a brigade from the 101st Airborne Division up at Fort Campbell who's now in Poland. And you don't have to look at the map very long to figure out what is going on. There are units from the 1st Cav and other units that are in other countries in that same region. We are positioning our people, and very quietly, you hardly ever see anything about it. If you don't know somebody in one of those units, you wouldn't know those units are deployed. And so I can see that because of my experience in the Army, but it's hard to convince people that, at some point, we have to say, well, wait a minute, are we going to do this again or are we not?
So go ahead, we have a question. Good.
Calvin, if I could just clarify something. You were with Public Information with the 101st?
I was with the Information Office. I was with the Information Office, and we had a Public Information side and a Command Information side.
I had that much later in the AmeriCal, but What was your experience with command pressure as far as what you were publishing? You had a newspaper, right?
Yeah, we had a newspaper
own
and
newspaper.
a quarterly magazine and a yearbook.
Okay. What kind of command pressures did you have? Because you did that for quite a while.
If there was any, I didn't feel it. My boss, who was the information officer,
usually they
might
tell
have
you
felt
about
it. But we were never directed or censored in any way.
Okay.
Now, I will tell you, newspapers have just X number of pages, and magazines have just X number of pages. So you can't print and run everything that all of these journalists are producing. So there was some editor, or the information officer said, well, we're not going to run this story because we don't have room for it. Or this story would be better if it had a picture, so we'll wait and we'll get a picture. I'm sure a lot of that went on. But in terms of directing us not to do something or... no, we never felt that. But I was I was a Spec 4. When you talk about command pressure, that really doesn't apply to me.
So the difference was not over what you could shoot, but what would get published.
Yeah, what would get released.
Right. Looking back over it, we're quite distant now from your years in Vietnam. Would you do it again, Cal?
I'm an Army guy. If I was ordered to go to Vietnam again, I would go. That's what the orders say. They say everybody on this list is going to Vietnam. That's what my orders originally said. And everybody on that list went.
John?
In a heartbeat. That part of my life made me who I am.
So it was worth the danger that you faced without realizing it, or without accepting it, I guess, for what came later in your life.
Well, I think John's earlier comment is really relevant here, that it's your job. That's what you're trained to do, and now you're actually in a unit to do that job, and you wake up in the morning. I used to spend a lot of time in the signal bunker at fire bases sleeping, and I'd wake up in the morning and get to work, and that's what I did, and so it becomes, after a while, kind of a little pedestrian until you start getting rocketed and mortared and people start trying to kill you again. But
it makes a difference. I've had John photographers tell me, and I've worked a lot with photographers over the years, that when they're looking through the lens, they feel like they're not really present, in a way that it distances them from what's happening right in front of them. Did you ever have that sense?
As I touched on some minutes ago, the advantage I had during some really bad times was that I was totally focused on what I was there to do, and that was to record the events. And it separates you in your mind from the moment.
Go ahead, Cal.
when I came back from R&R in Hong Kong, I had, like any good Army photographer, bought a lot of lenses there cheap. And I had this wide-angle lens that I bought. And I was at Firebase Airborne, and they had a 155 howitzer battery there. And I was walking around, wasn't anything going on, and I was looking for opportunities to use this wide-angle lens. And I went out from the gun position, and I looked up at the tube. And and took a picture. And I thought, gee, I can't wait to see this on a contact sheet. Well, one of the things I didn't see at the time, because I wasn't looking through the viewfinder, was there were two helicopters, one on each side in the air, that actually photobombed that picture. So that picture gets picked up by the Army Times, and it runs on the front page. I don't know this, okay? I get called back to Camp Eagle, and Major Horvath, who was the information officer then, picked me up in a Jeep, and I'm covered with mud head to foot, and I'm filthy dirty, hadn't had a shower in 2 weeks. And he takes me over to the commanding general's General Zace at the time. And we walk in, and the aide is there, and he looks at Major Horvath and says, "Is that the guy?" And points at me, and Major Horvath says, "Yes, this is him." And he says, "Wait just a moment." He goes in the inner office, and about a minute later, he comes back, opens the door, and comes in, and there's General Zace sitting at his desk. I'm thinking, what did I do, And he stands up and he comes around and he looks over to his aide and he says, "Post the order." And so they read my promotion order to E5. And I'm really startled. And anyway, he picks up the Army Times and he shows it to me. And he says, you get my unit on the front page of the Army Times again, I'll make you an E6. So when you have a tour punctuated with moments like that,
That's a wonderful story. John, what photograph or photographs are you most proud that you took in Vietnam?
I get tired of my photographs very early on. And there'll be something that I will like, and then I'll replace it with something else in my mind later. Probably there are one or two pictures from the Battle of Hue, but also there's some images from the Battle of Khe Sanh that stand out to me. You know what this is really about? I mean, undoubtedly, I went into the Battle of Hue as an E4 working for Stars and Stripes, and for all intents and purposes, I came out of it with a career based on that series of images. So my story is totally unique and all. When I reflect back on my time in Vietnam, my time with Stars and Stripes, what I gained from it, it's really about what the opportunity, how it affected me. It was my rite of passage. It gave me the ability to go from nowhere to somewhere based on what effort I wanted to put into it. So while the photography undoubtedly is critical to that, there's a lot of depth to that period of time.
To the experience, yeah. Well, John and Cal, thank you very much for sharing your experiences in Vietnam, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, folks.